Welcome to Hands-on AI Supervision by UNESCO. This series highlights the practical experiences, technical insights, and strategic priorities identified by experts working on the front lines of AI oversight. This interview series is funded by the European Union and is part of UNESCO's broader work on the ethical governance of AI. Welcome back to the mini podcast series, Hands-on AI Supervision, Lessons from Practice. My name is Max Kendrick. I'm the AI Strategy Coordinator and Senior Advisor in the Office of the Director General here at UNESCO. We're sitting in the UNESCO podcast studio, and I'm here with Nathalie Cohen, the head of the Regulatory Governance for Global Challenges Unit within the Regulatory Policy Division of the OECD, and a participant in the September 30 session of the second expert roundtable on AI supervision. Nathalie, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So I think both of us, we have this issue where our titles can be a bit of a mouthful, and it's hard to sort of understand exactly what we do. Could you tell us a little bit more about sort of what your job is, your personal responsibilities, and also what is the OECD doing in this broader space of regulation supervision?
Absolutely. So as you said, my name is Nathalie Cohen, and I'm from the Regulatory Policy Division at the OECD. And my role in particular looks at the topics of international regulatory cooperation, how to regulate for digital activities, and how you regulate for other challenges in a global and agile way that takes into account the fast pace of change and the particular issues of digital activities. And so within that, I head up a program called the Better Regulation in the Digital Age Initiative, which explores exactly these challenges and seeks to develop analysis tools and guidance to support policymakers and regulators.
And who are the audiences that you're mostly working with, policymakers, regulatory, et cetera?
So we work very often with regulatory policy experts within the member countries of the OECD, but not only members, also more broadly. And very often we work directly with regulators as well. So we do country support projects across both the design and the delivery and enforcement of regulations.
So one of the subject matters I guess we've been sort of talking about, and I guess I'm sort of guilty of always being a bit confused on this, sort of the bright line between, or is there a bright line? We use these sort of terms, supervisors and regulators somewhat interchangeably, but sometimes we use them in specific, scenarios. Who, I guess, in that space, who is your target audience? Is there sort of a nuance there that I think is important to sort of communicate before we dive in?
Yeah, well, I definitely think there can be a bit of a mix-up around the language that can get quite confusing for people. So from my perspective of working in this area, the people who actually create regulation are very often policymakers sitting in central government ministries. So they're quite at the heart of government. And then you have regulatory bodies or agencies that are then responsible for the delivery of regulations, and that's quite an operational thing. And so that comes down to things like risk-based inspections, fines, penalties, enforcement, and market surveillance, which is a different set of activities again. And when it comes to kind of supervisory authorities, to me that is the same thing as being a regulator. The main role of a regulator is to oversee the safety of products and services that are being placed on the market, and then undertaking that ongoing monitoring and market surveillance function.
And this is work that you've done since long before you joined the OECD. Is this a bit of a specialty of yours?
So I've been a civil servant and a policymaker for at least over 12 years for the UK government and the French governments prior to joining the OECD. And yeah, part of that was working on what we call better regulation within the Better Regulation Executive in the UK, as it was known at the time. And then, in other roles around government, actually creating policy that was regulatory policy and undertaking regulatory experimentation, although we just called it piloting at the time, but that's exactly what it was. So yeah, in various roles, working with legislation and regulation. And so
what's the transition been like? Because you started with the OECD in 2024. What has the transition felt like moving from that sort of working on this from design through implementation, stem to stern as a practitioner, to now this sort of more sort of like universal and holistic and sort of advisory and analytical role at the OECD?
So I think it's really beneficial to come from a country background and having done things operationally before going into the OECD. The OECD is a global perspective. So it brings together advice and tools and guidance that are of benefit for a wide range of policy and regulatory audiences. So by necessity, it can be a bit more high level because you're trying to create tools and guidance that then can fit a wide range of contexts. So that's been really fascinating, kind of getting that broader perspective on international best practice. But then also the combination of doing country support work means that you still get into the detail and the nitty-gritty of particular country issues on regulatory topics. So it's a great combination.
So I think it's a great segue into one of the things that we're sort of excited to talk about today, and I think is a major focus of the sessions that you were involved in at the last expert roundtable is AI risk mapping. And I think as a specific sort of as a tool, as a sort of set of approaches, it'd be great if you'd tell us a little bit about what AI risk mapping is, how you'd explain it, who does it, what's it about.
I think, first of all, there's probably two things. There's talking about AI risks in a global sense and understanding the specific kinds of risks that come about from AI. And then there is what a regulator or a supervisory authority was going to have to do when they're confronted with a specific AI regulatory system. So AI risk mapping in general describes the process of defining and assessing the potential risks that might be posed by an AI system. So the OECD has looked at the various tools that are out there. So there's an ISO standard on a risk management framework. I believe it's standard 31,000. There's also guidance.
It's good to get the number down for the listeners.
Yeah, and I think there's also a NIST risk management framework. So the US National Institute of Standards and Technology. And so the OECD has kind of looked at this existing risk management global practice and applied it to a life cycle definition of an AI system. Because with risk mapping, it isn't just a one and done exercise. You might identify the risks of a particular system, but those then need to be treated. So that could be kind of mitigated in some way or ceased completely, or accepted if the risks are acceptable. And then they need to be governed throughout the life cycle of the AI system as well.
Could you sort of explain that a little bit more? Like, when you talk about a life cycle of an AI system, I mean, what is the life cycle, and what are those inflection points at which you're engaging?
Yeah, so there's
or which a regulator would engage anyway.
Yeah, no, for sure. So there are kind of various different inputs into an AI system in the design phase. So you have kind of the data and computational inputs. You have development and testing of a system. You then have deployment of a system onto the market. You then have ongoing kind of governance, ongoing monitoring of that system. And the OECD also, by the way, has an incidents monitor when it comes to AI, which is a helpful tool to look at the real life risks materializing into problems as a result of AI systems. And then eventually there might be decommissioning of a system as well.
And so I guess there's also this question, I guess, of where does then these various sort of life cycle sort of gateways, where does, I guess, risk mapping sort of fit in as a practice? What are the inputs that you're taking at a given stage, and what does a basic regulator do with them, and sort of the engagement with the developers of an AI system or the deployers of an AI system?
Well, I would say that earlier you involve a regulator, the better. But potentially the regulator will become involved with a system at the point when it is reaching commercialization and it is seeking to be launched onto a market. And at that point, you would do the defining of the risk and then the evaluation and analysis of the risk. So in terms of definition, you need to consider the scope, the context, and the actors for each phase of the system, because how a system is built and developed is also important. and will affect the roles and responsibilities. So, for example, is the organization deploying the system? Has it just taken a model that has been pre-trained and it's putting it on the market, or is it retraining it and customizing the model? So then kind of who owns which risks going forward will be dictated by the way the system has been designed. So you need to understand the potential impacts on the context and the actors involved. That's the first stage. Second stage is then assessing the risks, and this is where you evaluate and you measure the risks. And I think a lot of people will be familiar of risk management methodologies where you assess the likelihood of a risk happening and then the level of harm that might happen. The OECD recommends you do this at individual, aggregate and societal levels concerning AI as well. And there are various metrics that are involved that can be used at that point.
And what I guess from your perspective, what skills do these exercise risk mapping and otherwise require of supervisors and regulators, both as individuals and as organizations?
Well, so I've mentioned the more traditional risk management skills, and these are the bread and butter of what regulators do and should be familiar. And I've mentioned there are already international frameworks and standards out there about risk management. But I think when it comes to AI, there's a real need to have more of a multidisciplinary perspective. So there are the legal and the compliance skills regulators need to have to understand compliance within a given regulatory environment. But increasingly, there's also a need for technical skills to really understand the AI systems that are being looked at, and particularly where some of the testing and certification is likely to be undertaken by independent third parties. Regulators need to be empowered as overseers of that process as well. So there is a kind of upskilling needed on the technical side. And then also human rights understanding and skills is another field. So there's also then the ability of the regulator to understand wider societal impacts on things such as human rights.
No, I think that's. I think there's something that you said there in terms of managing sort of the upskills, making sure that you have those skills. Of course, the more that you upskill a sort of given sort of population or set of individuals, the more specific those skills get, the more robust those skills get, the harder it is oftentimes to scale those skills. And I think one of the challenges, I think everyone reads the news, is wherever just this sort of this exponentially growing sort of level of activity in this space. And going back even to what you said about sort of engaging the regulators as sort of early as possible, how are these sort of bandwidth, gaps or capacity, or these, maybe they're not gaps, but these stressors on bandwidth and capabilities being managed? Or is that even sort of the biggest capability gap for authorities today, sort of in this field? I mean, it's one of the things that I think, is a challenge of just broadly regulatory approaches, that you have to have people behind it, right? You just have this ultimately, the number of, if you create a requirement that regulators are involved, you have to have enough regulators and supervisors to actually handle the work. And you mentioned sort of third party sort of verification assessment, but I'm sort of curious how what are the gaps that we face today, and certainly what are the approaches to managing this sort of what may feel in some ways, I'm sure it's not fully unprecedented because nothing is, but what's the best approach to managing this sort of question of scale and bandwidth and capacities on the regulatory side?
Well, it's a very complicated question. You've really put your finger on a major issue for regulators in terms of recruiting the new skills that they're going to need to manage activities involving AI. And actually, this came out as being one of the biggest challenges that regulators are facing when we had the conference back in September. So insufficient technical and regulatory expertise or digital literacy within supervisory bodies to assess and manage complex AI cases was highlighted as being a bit of a key problem. And also the fact that the kind of research and technical experts and community can be talking an entirely different vocabulary and language almost to policymakers and regulatory experts. So that's kind of already an issue right there, is getting the two communities to talk the right language to each other. And I think it's an ongoing problem. So there's no silver bullet, and there's no kind of here you go, everybody do this. But definitely, different countries are looking at creative ways to address this resourcing and capability gap. And I believe the Alan Turing Institute did a piece of research in the UK, for example, suggesting a kind of common pool of expertise for regulators to draw on, which caught my attention because that was an idea that came out of the September workshop that we did as well. So the idea is, how can regulators collaborate with each other and coordinate their activities, and maybe have a panel or a pool of expertise that they can then draw on to help them create strategies to increase their organizational agility and adaptivity.
No, I think that these questions too, I think everywhere when you're speaking about these gaps in terms of digital literacy, know-how, et cetera, it's something I think that, we here on the UNESCO side, OECD, I think not even just on the regulatory side, is that it's really, really hard to build a workforce in any of these places that's has the expertise, that has the understanding to tackle these things. And we're always very concerned about, hey, how are we getting the best people in, sort of the demand for sort of talent, and also the absence of a clear sort of identification or understanding of what is the appropriate skill set for a given task, given how quickly it's evolving, is a major challenge. The other one, you mentioned sort of the outcomes of the session at the roundtable, the hands-on session on AI supervision, that was identified as one of the sort of two biggest gaps. But the other one, which jumped out, is thinking here about that question of how can sort of regulators sort of coordinate better, and vocabulary is being very different. You're talking about sort of policy level, folks who are involved in regulation, and then you also the implementers and the people who sort of their communication gaps. But we are also seeing this, and I think it was represented in participation at the event, this enormous amount of fragmentation and overlap between authorities, between parties, as one of the major challenges identified in the exercise. Like EU level, national level, you have regional levels. I think we had some countries had sort of like 4 or 5 different sort of mixed jurisdiction groups that were engaging. What do you see as some of the best sort of methods or approaches in this kind of fragmented? I don't know if there's a precedent in other industries or fields that springs to mind of managing this sort of coordination and fragmentation challenge.
Well, I mean, this kind of gets into the international regulatory cooperation kind of field, I think, which is the other area that my team looks at, and there are various ways that you can do that. So as you mentioned, there is already some kind of regional cooperation. The EU has come forward with the EU AI Act, and then there's even a challenge within that around harmonizing implementation approaches. How is each member state going to implement its own regulatory sandbox and so on? So there are already there, even within a kind of harmonized legal framework across the region, difficulties with making sure that the implementation is harmonized. And there are big kind of policy choices around how you approach the regulation of AI. So some countries are taking a deliberate wait and see approach, and they're going in with kind of soft approaches, like encouraging the development of standards, but kind of no firm or binding regulatory approaches just yet. And so you've got big kind of fragmentation and diversity globally in the approach to regulating for AI. But then you also have the spread of AI safety institutions and kind of standards that are coming forward in AI. So I think multilateral efforts towards consensus on key things around AI safety, for instance, and kind of standardization and certification approaches that can be brought into the system, are helpful. But ultimately, it comes down to kind of cooperation that can happen at different levels. It can happen multilaterally, it can happen bilaterally, it can happen regionally. But I think a very challenging situation to see how regulation of AI is going to kind of coalesce.
No, I mean, I'll use that as a sort of an opportunity to make sort of, two programmatic plugs, for work that UNESCO has done. One is, we have, born from the 2021 recommendation on the ethics of AI, we have this readiness assessment methodology, which has turned into basically a policy making and strategy making sort of support function for states, all of our 193 member states, regardless of levels of development, helping sort of them figure out, identify the gaps in their approaches, where they have approaches, which isn't, again, given the shortfall of expertise, and helping them sort of figure out how to fill those in. But of course, in doing so, there's this thing where it's a super fast evolving field, and so we're going through a process now. Of course, is looking back at sort of progress so far with the first 80-something states that have sort of signed up and have this underway, and saying, okay, well, what do we need to do to sort of revise our approaches here? What are the best practices that we've learned? And I think likewise, one of the things I think was really exciting about the expert roundtable on AI supervision is that and this is maybe it's a bit more of a personal opinion, but really seeing that transmission of information, sort of informally, sort of laterally, best practices between folks as a really great way of identifying best practices and ways forward. So those are the sort of two shameless plugs for sort of UNESCO programs. And from where I sit in the Director General's office, they're sort of two of what we think are some of the highest impact ones. I think going back on that sort of question of sort of fragmentation and sort of approaches, I'm sort of curious if you've seen, are there any sort of like success stories or best practices that you've seen where you've seen like, okay, there's something there's some sort of like germ of insight there that we might be able to sort of tease out, and maybe you feel, or something that you've observed, you're like, that's a great story that not enough people yet know about. And I'm curious if there's anything sort of that's jumped out in your experience as something that has that kind of stimulating, thought-provoking, or potentially useful effect.
Well, I think it's too early to say who's got it right on the regulation of AI. But one thing that does stand out is that some countries have gone down the route of having a central AI authority, whereas other countries are pursuing a sectoral strategy. For example, like in the Thailand or in the UK, where they're not yet convinced of the need to have a central specific AI regulatory authority, and they think that the coordination can be managed across sectors in a different way, and they're looking at putting in place different governance mechanisms across sectoral regulators, which can also be done very effectively. There's no right or wrong way. So I think it's how government, linking back to your RAM methodology, how governments are taking a kind of holistic system view of their digital regulators and looking at how the various roles and capabilities fit together, and do they have the right coordination mechanisms in place.
Well, you raise an interesting point there, which is that with a lot of these things in terms of like best practice or what works best, is it's too early to see. I mean, there's this sort of, I guess, challenge of, everything we're doing is too early to see. And I don't want to say that it's sort of it leads to sort of questions about sort of, legitimacy or et cetera. But I mean, I guess what is, in a world in which we just sort of accept that we're not going to necessarily going to get enough high quality data before the decision needs to be made, where regulators are, it's a very interesting position as regulators are operating in a space where they have to make decisions without really having very perfect data. And what do you think are the best tools or resources in this highly imperfect information environment that can help authorities sort of assess and effectively address these risks?
Yeah, well, so one of the challenges that regulators face is the asymmetry of information between what the regulator sees, what data it has access to, and the owners of the AI systems that are bringing them to market. And one way that you can try and overcome this information asymmetry is through regulatory sandboxes. And we've seen a big resurgence of interest in regulatory sandboxes, which have been around for decades and originated in financial services, but are now being applied quite extensively to AI. And the reason for that is that it is kind of moving the model of the sandbox forward, because it's seeing it more as a space for regulatory learning, which benefits the regulator, but which also enables the private sector companies participating to potentially have a role in influencing the design of a future regulatory or governance regime. So it's kind of a test space or an experimental space with regulatory oversight that can help the regulator get more data and more understanding on the AI systems in question. So regulatory experimentation is one way to deal with that uncertainty.
Sandboxing obviously is I think the first expert roundtable. It was sort of like all sandboxing all the time, and I think that there's a lot of. I think it's clear that all the participants in these discussions are very, I think, bullish on that as a tool. But I guess maybe speaking to your blank is, in this information asymmetry gap, have you seen any other sort of useful ways forward, or are there other areas that you think that we haven't quite figured out, or sort of gaps in our own sort of ability to sort of engage or assume a sort of adaptive, iterative, lesson driven, and I hate the word learning driven approach to quick iteration.
Well, what you just described is very much what I would envisage being agile regulatory governance, which is all about kind of iterative learning processes, experimentation, applying outcomes-based approaches to regulation, also engaging in anticipatory governance and involving strategic foresight and horizon scanning. And those kinds of exercises can be helpful when it comes to overcoming uncertainty as well. So I think it's just organizationally designing processes to be more agile and iterative and engaged in a learning process. But another thing that regulators can do as well is to actually appropriate AI tools for themselves. So actually start to look at how they could implement AI-enabled tools as part of their regulatory activities. And this is something that the regulatory policy team at the OECD has done quite frequently with regulators, for example, to help target risk-based inspections. So kind of actually building in that digital literacy into a regulator can be helpful for kind of overcoming those kinds of knowledge gaps as well. And they could become very important in the future when it comes to being able to order AI with AI in order to ensure that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, that it's reliable, accurate, and so on.
No, and I think that there's, I think your point on sort of agile regulatory governance, I think agility and organizational agility is such a challenge in this intergovernmental, especially international organization context. It's something that we're always sort of thinking about. It can be quite frustrating for those of us who've also seen it in other types of organizations, and to see, how strong some of the pressures against agility can sometimes be, like a status quo, especially, when systems that were at one point in time very cutting edge and approaches that were very cutting edge were very hard to put in place and are a major accomplishment. Now all of a sudden they're faced by new realities. I guess I wonder here from the regulatory perspective, I'm always thinking about this question, like, are there any pickups? Are there any things that we can sort of do, like pick up relatively easily, or like in a new context? Are there opportunities? Are we scanning the horizon enough for new opportunities that might not have been achievable in a prior context? And thinking a bit here too about necessity as the mother of invention, right? And I'm curious if do you think that the specific nature of the AI challenge, so the areas in which it's not where there is no clear precedent, are you optimistic, I guess, and this is you personally, not the official OECD view, but are you optimistic that this may also be sort of an incubation moment for new approaches?
So I am actually quite optimistic about the potential of AI and other technologies to transform the way that we do regulatory policy. It's something I'm looking at specifically at the moment within my team, and I'm really interested in this, and there's lots of ideas out there. For example, how do you use AI in regulatory impact assessment to do modeling on the costs to business of a proposed policy? There's the rules as code agenda. So how do you publish law in a machine readable and executable format so that it can be picked up by other digital implementers and then translated to end users via a chatbot? there are kind of all kinds of interesting things that you can envisage, and countries are experimenting quite widely actually with these kinds of technologies. But at the moment, they've stayed quite pilot stage, so we're yet to see lots of kind of rollout of these technologies at scale. But I think there's huge potential for them to transform the way that we do regulatory policy and regulating in time as well.
I think there's one, I think that sort of other question is you mentioned sort of end users, and, you know, I guess there's a more formal sort of, let's say, hey, you know, multi-stakeholder approaches, getting sort of feedback, civil society engagement, et cetera. But, you know, I've also wondered if there's more that we can be doing to also rethink more broadly. I think in any organization we work in slightly different space, but rethinking who our end users and audiences are. And I think that there's also like a question here. I guess maybe it's a little bit abstract for this point in time of this discussion, but is there an opportunity here to think about to rethink who an end user or who a participant in a regulatory process might be and the ways that they engage as well? And I think and I'll come back, I'll bring it back to that question, but I think one of the very interesting dynamics is we're also seeing a place where a lot of sort of de facto policy making is being executed or being implemented on the part of non-traditional policy authorities. For example, private sector developers are de facto writing policy. And I think there's an interesting question there. I'm curious if what you've seen or what you're thinking about in terms of who the other participants may be and what that participation may look like.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, actually. And I think when you're considering the risk of an AI system, you have to think quite broadly, because you have to think of the overall impact that might happen, in terms of societal impacts, in terms of democratic impacts, or sustainability, environmental impacts. So there are lots of actors that may be impacted by an AI system, particularly if there are negative externalities or unintended consequences that arise. So you have to have kind of a macro perspective as well on what an AI system is attempting to do and what the knock-on impacts of it might be. But there are various ways in which different kinds of stakeholders and actors, including civil society and vulnerable communities, could be engaged at different points, and they could even be engaged in the design side of a system, and that's one way of seeking to avoid biases and discrimination is through testing and involving diverse teams in the design process, and then in terms of the risk mapping as well, you need to kind of integrate broader principles such as the OECD's AI principles that include looking at things like democracy, rule of law, human rights, human agency, and how you allow for human intervention through safeguard mechanisms. So something that is being referred to as human in the loop approaches. And then, in terms of the kind of once the system is on the market, what might be a role for civil society and other end users? Well, it could be in signaling incidents and reporting issues as well. So yeah, it does kind of challenge the traditional model of who the end user is and who regulators should be talking to and who businesses should be considering and taking into account in the development and deployment of their systems. And
I think also who UNESCO and the OECD and others should be speaking to as well, as coming from these traditionally very governmental and sort of state-driven processes. So last question, looking ahead, what is one piece of advice that you would give to sort of regulators, starting this journey of figuring out how they should be, maybe I think for us, where UNESCO was very thinking about sort of like all states, all communities, but maybe those who are sort of a bit nearer to the starting line of this AI regulatory journey than the finish. So I guess we sort of that no one's anywhere near the finish line on this. But for those starting out, what do you think is like the top piece of advice that you might give?
Well, I think a lot of regulators are still very early on in their journey in figuring all of this out. The one piece of advice that I have is to look at what's already out there. So I mentioned the fact that there are ISO standards and there are NIST frameworks. Look at the OECD publications as well on the categorization of AI systems, on advancing accountability in AI risk governance. There are proposals there that go into some detail about how you should break risk down, what metrics are available, to look at each category of risk. To kind of avoid the initial overwhelm, I would say go in and look at what is out there, because there is already useful information out there, and as I say, kind of risk management is well tested territory.
So there's a lot out there to sort of soak it all in, and before you rush to take any actions. But no, look, Nathalie, this has been really wonderful having you here with us today. We're really appreciative of you taking the time and appreciative of your participation in these discussions. And we look forward to sort of finding more and more ways to sort of deepen this collaboration between supervisory authorities, expert analysts, and agencies like our own. And we really appreciate your enthusiastic participation in this process.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Wonderful. You've been listening to Hands-on AI Supervision, an interview series by UNESCO. This series highlights the practical experiences, technical insights, and strategic priorities identified by experts working on the front lines of AI oversight. To continue the conversation and learn more about UNESCO's work on AI ethics, policy, and in culture, science, and education, follow us at unesco.org. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode.